Prior to being Stoic, were you involved in any other religion or philosophy?
Yes. So I grew up as a Catholic.
Catholic.
Because I grew up in Rome, literally not far from the Pope, not far from the Vatican. So kind of by default, although my family is not very religious, but nevertheless, kind of by default, I was a Catholic. I left the church when I was a teenager for a number of reasons. I was talking to my priest that I was in contact with, and I started asking uncomfortable questions. Like, I was going to say, so explain to me this Trinity thing. How is it possible that God is one and at the same time is three? Mm-hmm. I said, this was, I was a teenager, I was in high school. Remember, I was studying philosophy in high school, right? So I said, that violates one of the fundamental principles of logic, the principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot be A and not A. Mm-hmm. It cannot be 1 and 3. And the priest's response was very unsatisfactory. He said, this is a mystery of faith. It's like, well, that's a cop-out. You're not telling me anything. What do you mean? I said, okay, let's try something else. Let's try transubstantiation, which is a specifically Catholic doctrine that says that when you go and have communion in church, they give you the little holy wafer and then the wine. They actually use wine. But in a lot of places in the United States, you use grape juice. That's actually wine. Okay, great. So I said, so these are meant to be representing the body and the blood of Christ, right? And the priest says, no, they literally are the body and the blood of Christ. I said, really? Because that doesn't, I don't know what flesh tastes like, but that tastes like a wafer to me. And I know what blood tastes, because occasionally I cut myself and stuff like that. That's not blood, that's just wine. And he said, mystery of faith. And it's like, okay, that's not good enough.
So that's like what deterred you away from.
That turned me away. It's like, I'm sorry, you're just not giving me answers to very basic, I would think, straightforward questions. I just want to make sense of what you're telling me. And if you're telling me, I don't basically, mystery of faith just means I don't know. I have no idea how this works. So that kind of started me out on a quest for looking for something else. And I landed pretty quickly on an approach that I already mentioned. It's called secular humanism. So secular humanism comes out of a long list of philosophers, beginning perhaps with Bertrand Russell, British philosopher of the early part of the 20th century, who incidentally wrote a book called Why I'm Not a Christian, which I read when I was in high school. I was like, this guy's actually interesting. And then there are contemporary secular humanists. At the time when all this was happening, two of the major ones were Carl Sagan, who was an astronomer here in the United States, and they had a big influence on me because I actually was interested in astronomy when I was young, so I knew who he was, and then I discovered that he was also a secular humanist. I said, that's an interesting combination. Here's somebody who I admire because of his science, but as it turns out, he also sort of approaches things philosophically from a different perspective. A guy named Paul Kurtz, who died a few years ago, he was a philosopher at SUNY Buffalo, and he started out an organization called the Council for Secular Humanism, which really develops and sort of popularizes the philosophy. So there were resources out there. So I started reading these guys. Later on, I actually get to meet Paul Kurtz. Never met Carl Sagan, unfortunately. He died too young. So there were resources. Now, for a long time, therefore, for like 20, 30 years, I considered myself a secular humanist. Then the problem was that secular humanism turned out not to be very practical when I started having actual problems. Yes, as your life is going well, you don't really need much of a philosophy, or at least, well, let me take that back. Actually, I think you do, but you don't realize it. You don't put the philosophy to the test because things are going fine. But then when I hit my 40s, the famous midlife crisis, not only I was starting to look for something different to do, I also was hit by a couple of things. My father died fairly suddenly. I was hit by a divorce that I did not expect. You know, my wife filed for divorce without actually me having any idea that this was happening, that there was any problem. And that happened pretty much the same time, within a span of a few months. And so I thought, oh, okay, so what kind of resources does ecumenism have to help me go through this kind of stuff? And the answer was, not much, as it turns out. Because ecumenism is about broad ideas. It's about human rights, which I certainly agree with, but that doesn't help me with a divorce, right. Or it doesn't help me when my father dies. I cannot invoke human rights. Psychohumanism has to do with support for science and reason. Great, I'm a scientist, I support science and reason. But again, when it comes to a specific problem, what does that tell me? How am I supposed to actually apply this? And that's what led me to start looking for something else, and eventually, as we were saying earlier, I landed on Stoicism.
So seeing that you saw contradictions in Christianity, do you think there's any flaws within Stoicism?
Oh, there are flaws everywhere. These are all human creations as far as I'm concerned, both religions and philosophies, and humans are fallible. So yes, there are. I can actually point out a couple. So for one thing, Stoicism started out about 2,400 years ago, at the end of the 4th century, before the current era. And so, more than 2,000 years later, you think, okay, surely they got something wrong. And sure enough, they did, especially in terms of metaphysics. They did certainly get something wrong, I think. For instance, the ancient Stoics thought that, in terms of metaphysics, they thought that the universe itself is a living organism, endowed with what they call the logos, which basically means reason. Well, I'm a scientist in the 21st century. I don't believe that the universe is a living organism endowed with reason. The universe is a set of processes that follow what we call natural laws. So they were wrong on that one. Now, you would think, okay, so what? Just change that with modern physics, not a problem. But the problem is that there actually are connections, typically, both in philosophies and in religions, between the metaphysics and the ethics. And the ethics is what really matters at the end of the day, right? You want to behave in certain ways. For instance, ancient metaphysics, Stoic metaphysics, led to to an understanding of providence. Basically, the Stoics thought, hey, the universe itself is a living organism. That means we're literally bits and pieces of the universe, right? So whatever happens to us is for the good of the universe, of the body. That sounds great. That's a great idea, right? That makes sense of your life. That means that when bad stuff is happening to you, you can find consolation and acceptance in the notion that, well, this is bad for me, but hey, the universe is actually better off. Think of it this way. Imagine you are a cell of a living body, right? Well, the cell might at some point die. In fact, it might have to die, otherwise it becomes a cancer, right? From the point of view of the cell, that's not that good, right? Oh, I have to die. Oh, crap, right? But then you can tell yourself, but wait a minute, the fact that I'm dying here actually is good for the whole body. This is what I'm supposed to do. This is something really that makes sense of my entire existence. That's great. But if you take out the notion of a living universe, then that kind of reasoning goes out the window, right? Now you have to replace it with something else. So yeah, there are things in Stoicism in the ancient Stoicism that don't work, and that's why a number of people these days are working toward sort of changing and updating the philosophy.
So do you think there is such thing as a perfect philosophy?
I don't even know what that would look like.
Like, why follow Stoicism instead of something like nihilism or existentialism?
Or like, what questions would a philosophy have to answer for you to consider it complete? Like, is there any question that you really wish you had the answer to that is just not addressed by any philosophy?
Oh, I think a lot of philosophies are complete in that sense. I mean, Stoicism is a complete system. It has answers for every question. The question is, the issue is,
do you like the answers?
Are they, well, not just whether I like them or not, but are they the right answers? Some of them might not be the right answers. So no, I don't think there's such a thing as a perfect philosophy. There certainly are complete philosophies. There are coherent philosophies and not so coherent ones. When you want a system that is coherent, meaning that it doesn't have internal contradictions. If it has contradictions, then it's problematic. Then there is something that is not working well. And you want something that works.
Mm-hmm.
Works in the sense of actually helping you navigate your life in a better way. So, in answer to your question of, what about nihilism or other approaches, I think that some philosophies do work. I don't think Stoicism is the philosophy. I think that several philosophies and religions work well enough, and it's perfectly fine if one picks one or the other. Stoicism works for me and for a number of other people. Buddhism works well for other people. Existentialism works. I have friends who follow, take an existentialist look. Nihilism, not so much. I think there are philosophies that don't work very well. And the reason for that is because nihilism tends to be, for instance, antisocial. If you're a nihilist, you don't give a crap about anything and anybody.
Slang.
Yeah, it's like, oh, okay, fine. So nothing matters, fine. Then just why don't you commit suicide? It's like if nothing matters, why you stick around? So some philosophies I think are actually not very good, and the same goes for religions, right? So some of them actually do help people live a better life, both as individuals and as members of a society, and others are not so much.
Do you think philosophy in general leads to more questions or answers?
Ideally, it leads to more questions. That is one of the differences between philosophies and religions. Right? Religions tend to be heavy on answers, although sometimes the answers are, it's a mystery of faith. But nevertheless, that's an answer. Yeah, philosophies, at least ideally, generate discussions. They help you think about stuff. They don't give you answers necessarily. They just give you a general framework that helps you find your own answers. So for instance, take again the case of Stoicism. I said that I try to live according to the 4 cardinal virtues, but that's only a framework. It doesn't, the philosophy itself doesn't tell me specifically in any particular situation, well, how to act. That's up to me. I have to interpret the general framework and ask myself, well, is this thing wise, courageous, just, and temperate? I might be wrong in interpreting it in a specific case, right? It might be that I tell myself, oh yeah, this passes the test, and then somebody else says, are you sure? Because actually, as it turns out, you didn't think about it that way. We are not sages. The sage is the ideal human being who never gets things wrong. I don't think there are any such thing as sages.
Doesn't exist.
No.